A homeless Navy SEAL drained his flooded basement. Then his dog uncovered the secret they tried to drown forever. At 68, Frank Dalton had nothing left but an old pickup, a dead brother's ruined mountain relay station, and a retired military dog named Shadow. Deep in the Smoky Mountains, surrounded by fog and floodwater, Shadow kept barking at something hidden beneath the basement floor. Frank thought he'd inherited a condemned building, but under the black water waited a secret powerful enough to expose decades of buried lies. Comment 1 if you trust dogs more than people, or 0 if you think Frank should have walked away. And tell us where you're watching from. The rain started just outside Chattanooga and followed Frank Dalton the rest of the way to Knoxville like something unfinished. By the time he pulled into the parking lot of Baxter and Green Legal Services, the windshield of his old Ford pickup looked like a sheet of black river water. The wipers dragged across the glass with a tired squeal that matched the ache in his shoulders. Frank shut the engine off and sat still for a moment, with both hands on the wheel. The truck ticked softly as it cooled. Everything he owned was inside it. A duffel bag in the back seat, 2 blankets, a locked metal box filled with Navy records and hospital bills, a faded photograph of his wife, Claire, smiling beside a lake 20 years ago before the cancer hollowed her out from the inside. Frank rubbed his thumb across the steering wheel. The skin along his knuckles was scarred and pale from old burns and colder places. At 68, his hands looked like driftwood left too long in the tide. The passenger seat creaked. A Belgian Malinois lifted his head from the torn upholstery and looked at him with calm amber eyes. The dog had belonged to Earl. Frank still wasn't sure why the lawyer had insisted the animal be present for the reading of the will. "You stay here a minute," Frank said quietly. The dog watched him, but didn't move. Frank opened the truck door and stepped into the rain. The cold hit his knees first, arthritis, another souvenir from years carrying too much weight in too many deserts. The lawyer's office sat above a pawn shop and a tax service storefront. Yellow light glowed through fogged windows. Frank climbed the stairs slowly, one hand brushing the rail as thunder rolled somewhere over the city. The receptionist looked up when he entered. She couldn't have been older than 25. Her eyes moved over. The soaked flannel jacket, the boots worn smooth at the heels, the gray beard he hadn't trimmed properly in weeks. Recognition flickered in her expression. Not recognition of who he was. Recognition of what he was. Homeless. "You're here for the Dalton estate?" she asked softly. Frank nodded once. "Second door on the left." The hallway smelled like old coffee and wet carpet. Frank could already hear Travis talking before he reached the room. His son's voice carried the sharp confidence of a man who spent too much time closing deals over conference calls. "The property taxes alone probably buried him." A woman laughed quietly. "Megan." Frank paused outside the doorway for half a second. Then he stepped inside. The room fell silent. Travis sat near the window in a navy jacket worth more than Frank's truck. His hair was trimmed short and neat, streaked with expensive gray at the temples. A silver watch gleamed beneath his sleeve as he checked his phone one last time before sliding it into his pocket. Megan sat beside him, elegant and distant in a cream-colored coat. She smelled faintly of perfume Frank remembered buying her mother years ago, when things were still good between all of them. Neither of them stood. Neither hugged him. Frank took the empty chair nearest the door. "You're late," Travis said. "I'm on time." "Barely." Frank ignored him. At the front of the room, attorney Daniel Baxter adjusted his glasses and opened a folder thick with paperwork. Rain tapped softly against the windows. "Thank you all for coming," Baxter said. "We'll begin with the formal distribution of Earl Dalton's estate." Frank stared at the tabletop. He hadn't seen Earl in nearly 4 years. Not because they hated each other, because men like them drifted into silence too easily. Two brothers who came home from different wars carrying different ghosts. Earl had chosen the mountains. Frank had chosen motion. Neither had really survived what came after. The lawyer cleared his throat. To Travis Dalton, Earl leaves the 40-acre farmland parcel bordering Miller's Creek, including mineral rights and associated equipment. Travis nodded once. No emotion, like he'd expected it. To Megan Dalton, Earl leaves his 2020 Chevrolet Silverado and personal savings account totaling $86,000. Megan looked genuinely surprised at that. That much? She whispered. Baxter gave a small nod. Frank looked out the rain-streaked window. Earl had money? The old bastard lived like a hermit in the mountains. Frank remembered cracked boots, beans cooked over propane, a coat stitched at both elbows. Where the hell had $86,000 come from? Baxter turned another page. And to Frank Dalton. The room quieted slightly. Frank looked up. The lawyer adjusted his glasses again. Earl leaves the property located at Black Hollow Ridge near the Tennessee-North Carolina border, formerly designated as Cold War Emergency Relay Station 14. Travis actually laughed. You're kidding. Baxter continued carefully. The structure is currently condemned by county order due to severe flood damage and foundation instability. Megan frowned. That old relay station? She asked. The creepy place in the mountains? That is correct. Travis leaned back in his chair. Jesus Christ. Baxter kept reading. Additionally, Earl leaves ownership and care of retired military canine Shadow. Frank blinked once. What? The lawyer slid a paper across the table. A Belgian Malinois, 9 years old. Registered search and rescue animal. Earl requested the dog remain with you. Travis shook his head, grinning in disbelief. So let me get this straight. He pointed toward Frank. You gave him a condemned building full of floodwater and an old dog? Earl made his wishes very clear. Megan finally looked at Frank directly. You can't seriously keep that place, she said quietly. The county's been trying to tear it down for years. Frank said nothing. The lawyer opened one final envelope. There is also a handwritten statement Earl requested be read aloud. The room settled again. Even Travis stopped smirking. Baxter unfolded the paper slowly. His voice softened as he read. Frank still knows what it means to stand watch. Silence. The rain outside seemed louder suddenly. Frank stared at the tabletop so hard the wood grain blurred. Watch. The word pulled memories loose whether he wanted them or not. Black ocean water. Rotor wash hammering the deck of a carrier. Young men checking rifles beneath red emergency lights. A medic screaming for plasma. The smell of diesel fuel and blood. Frank swallowed hard. Across the room, Travis shifted awkwardly. That's it? He asked. Baxter folded the note carefully. That's it. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then Travis stood and buttoned his jacket. Well, he said, forcing brightness into his voice, guess we should head out before the roads flood. Megan gathered her purse. Neither of them looked at Frank again. Not really. The lawyer handed over the documents. Frank signed where he was told. His signature shook slightly from the cold. Or maybe exhaustion. Outside, the storm had worsened. The parking lot reflected the city lights in broken silver puddles. Frank descended the stairs slowly. He could hear Travis behind him talking about land value and developers and tax write-offs. Like Earl's life could be measured in acreage. Frank reached his truck and stopped. The Belgian Malinois sat beside the passenger door in the rain. Perfectly still. The dog's dark coat was soaked through, water dripping from his muzzle. A scar crossed one side of his face near the eye. His ears stood alert despite his age. He looked at Frank without fear, without uncertainty, like he'd already made a decision. You're supposed to go with them? Frank asked quietly. The dog didn't move. Travis came down the stairs carrying a folder under one arm. There's no way I can take that animal, he said immediately. Claire's allergic. Megan? She shook her head. I travel too much. Shadow never took his eyes off Frank. The old seal sighed. Figures. Travis shoved his hands into his pockets. You know that station's worthless, right? He said. I talked to somebody about it a few years ago. Whole mountain's unstable. Flooding washed half the access road out. Frank looked up slowly. A few years ago? Just conversation. Nothing serious. Something about the way Travis said it bothered him immediately, but he was too tired to chase it. Thunder rolled again across Knoxville. Shadow moved closer to Frank's leg, not begging, guarding. Frank looked down at the dog. You ride good? The Malinois tilted his head slightly. Travis snorted. Great. The two of you can go be mountain ghosts together. Megan shot him a look. What? Frank opened the passenger door. Shadow jumped into the truck without hesitation and settled into the seat Earl used to occupy. Frank climbed behind the wheel. For a moment, he simply sat there listening to the rain hammer the roof. The city lights blurred through the windshield. Beside him, Shadow rested his head against the torn seat and watched the storm. Frank started the engine. The heater coughed weakly to life. He pulled out of the parking lot slowly. In the rearview mirror, Travis and Megan grew smaller beneath the yellow streetlight until the rain swallowed them completely. The highway out of Knoxville curved east toward the mountains, toward Black Hollow Ridge, toward a condemned station buried somewhere in the Smokies, toward the last thing nobody wanted. Frank drove in silence for nearly 20 minutes before he realized something strange. The dog hadn't looked away from the road once, not a single time, as if he already knew exactly where they were going, and had been waiting for someone to take him back. The interstate slowly disappeared behind them. Knoxville faded into wet orange lights and dark overpasses, while the mountains ahead rose like enormous shadows against the storm. Frank drove east through sheets of rain, the old pickup rattling every time the tires struck standing water. Shadow never moved from the passenger seat. Most dogs paced during long drives. Most dogs whined. This one sat perfectly upright with his eyes fixed on the black road ahead. Military dog, Frank thought. Disciplined right down to the bone. The heater coughed lukewarm air across the cab. Frank flexed stiff fingers against the wheel and glanced at the dashboard clock. 11:47 p.m. Too late to stop anywhere decent. Not that he had money for decent anymore. The gas needle hovered just above empty. He reached for the pack of crackers sitting beside the console, opened it carefully, and ate two without tasting them. Then he held one toward Shadow. The dog took it gently. No snapping, no greed, just calm obedience. You got manners, Frank muttered. The Malinois lowered his head slightly, as if acknowledging the statement. Outside, the rain thickened. The highway narrowed into winding mountain roads lined with black pine forest. Fog rolled across the asphalt in slow, pale waves. The deeper they drove into the Smokies, the more the world seemed to disappear behind them. Frank knew these roads, not the exact turns, but roads like them. Afghanistan had roads like this in winter. Narrow, dark, too quiet. He tightened his grip on the wheel. A sudden flash of lightning lit the mountainside. For half a second, the trees became silhouettes of men standing shoulder to shoulder in the darkness. Frank blinked hard. The image vanished immediately. Just trees. Only trees. His jaw tightened. PTSD didn't arrive like people imagined. Not screaming, not dramatic. Sometimes it was only a flicker, a sound, a smell, a memory stepping into the room before you realized the door had opened. Shadow's ears twitched. Without warning, the dog leaned across the seat and pressed one paw against Frank's arm. Firm, steady, grounding him. Frank exhaled slowly. "I'm fine," he said quietly. But he wasn't. Not really. He hadn't been fine since 1991. The road curved sharply uphill. An old green highway sign emerged through the fog. Black Hollow Ridge, 11 miles. Frank stared at it for a long moment. He remembered Earl mentioning the place years ago during one of their rare phone calls. "Old relay station up in the mountains," Earl had said. "Government forgot it existed. Suits me fine." Frank hadn't asked questions. That was the problem with the Dalton men. Silence became habit. By the time you realized what should have been said, half your life was already gone. The pavement eventually gave way to gravel. The truck bounced violently over potholes and washed out ruts. Tree branches scraped the sides like fingernails. Somewhere below them, hidden in darkness, rushing creek water thundered through the valley. The mountain road climbed another mile, then another. No lights, no houses, no signs of life at all. Finally, Shadow sat up straighter, alert, focused. The dog let out one low sound deep in his throat. Not a growl. Recognition. Frank slowed the truck. Ahead, through the rain and fog, something enormous appeared between the trees. A rusted steel antenna tower leaned crookedly against the mountainside. Beside it stood the relay station. Frank stared through the windshield in silence. The place looked dead. Not abandoned. Dead. The building sat on a ridge overlooking the valley below, its concrete walls stained black from years of rain and neglect. Several windows were boarded shut. One side of the roof had partially collapsed inward. Vines crawled up the outer walls like veins. A chain-link fence surrounded the property, though half of it had fallen flat into the weeds long ago. The beam of the headlights swept across a faded government warning sign, hanging crooked beside the gate. Condemned. Unsafe structure. Below that, no trespassing. Hell of an inheritance, Frank murmured. Shadow was already staring toward the building. The dog's posture had changed completely. Every muscle rigid. The old military focus had returned to him instantly. Frank killed the engine. The silence that followed felt enormous. Rain hammered the roof. Wind moved through the trees with a low, hollow moan. Somewhere far below, creek water crashed against rocks. Frank opened the truck door slowly. Cold mountain air flooded inside. Shadow jumped out first. The dog landed softly despite his age and immediately began moving toward the relay station with urgent, deliberate steps. "Easy," Frank called. Shadow ignored him. Frank grabbed the flashlight from the dashboard and followed. Mud sucked at his boots as he crossed the overgrown lot. Tall weeds brushed his knees. The antenna tower groaned overhead every time the wind shifted. The closer he got to the station, the stranger the place felt. Not dangerous, exactly. Watched. The front entrance hung partially open. Shadow slipped inside without hesitation. Frank shined the flashlight into the darkness and stepped after him. The smell hit immediately. Standing water, rotting wood, rust, mold. The beam swept across old concrete hallways lined with peeling paint and exposed wires hanging from the ceiling like dead vines. Water dripped steadily somewhere deeper inside. The station had once been military. Frank recognized it instantly. Reinforced walls, narrow corridors, emergency bulkhead doors, Cold War infrastructure, built to survive things ordinary buildings couldn't. Shadow moved ahead through the darkness with surprising confidence, like he'd walked these halls 1,000 times before. Frank followed slowly, His flashlight passed faded military markings stenciled onto the walls. Authorized signal access only. Emergency power below Sector B. The beam finally landed on a heavy steel door standing partly open near the rear hallway. Shadow stopped there, completely still. Then the dog looked back at Frank once, waiting. Frank approached carefully. The moment he stepped through the doorway, he heard it. Water. A deep, slow sound, not dripping, moving. His flashlight angled downward. Concrete stairs descended into darkness, and below them, black water. The basement was flooded almost to the ceiling. The surface reflected the flashlight beam in trembling silver ripples. Pipes protruded from the waterline near the upper walls. Broken shelves floated near the far side of the room, like wreckage after a storm. Frank counted silently. 1, 2, 3 visible steps before the water swallowed the staircase completely. Jesus. The place looked more like a drowned bunker than a basement. Shadow descended to the final dry step. Then he sat, watching the water, not moving. Frank frowned. What is it? The dog didn't react. Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains. A sharp flash of lightning burst through the basement windows near the ceiling. And suddenly Frank wasn't in Tennessee anymore. He was back in Fallujah. Black water, concrete walls, flooded tunnels, someone screaming over comms. Move, move, move! Frank stumbled backward hard enough to slam against the hallway wall. His breathing turned ragged instantly. Not here, not now. His pulse thundered in his ears. Another flash of lightning exploded outside. For one horrifying second, he saw drowned Marines floating beneath the waterline, faces pale beneath the surface, hands reaching upward. Frank squeezed his eyes shut. Stop, he whispered hoarsely. The panic kept climbing. His chest tightened violently. The basement seemed smaller suddenly, the air thinner. Then Shadow moved. The Malinois climbed the stairs calmly, crossed the hallway, and pressed his entire body against Frank's legs. Solid, warm, real. Frank grabbed the dog's thick collar instinctively. Shadow stayed perfectly still, grounding him again. Frank focused on the feel of wet fur beneath his fingers, the smell of rainwater and mud, the steady breathing of the animal beside him. Slowly, the tunnel in his chest loosened. The flooded basement returned to being only a basement, not a grave, not a battlefield. Frank leaned his head briefly against the wall. Good dog, he whispered. Shadow remained beside him until Frank's breathing steadied completely. Then the dog turned back toward the basement stairs, watching the water again. Always the water. Frank looked down into the darkness. Something about the dog's behavior disturbed him deeply now. This wasn't curiosity. This wasn't fear either. It was vigilance. Like Shadow believed something was still down there, something important. The wind howled outside. Rain lashed the mountain. Frank suddenly realized how exhausted he truly was. He hadn't slept properly in nearly 3 days. He wasn't staying inside that building tonight. Not yet. Come on, he muttered. Shadow hesitated. The dog looked down toward the flooded basement one last time before finally following Frank outside. The rain had weakened slightly. Fog drifted through the pine trees surrounding the ridge. The mountains beyond the valley were invisible now, swallowed completely by darkness. Frank spread one blanket across the bench seat inside the truck and leaned the seat back as far as it would go. Shadow jumped in beside him. The dog turned twice before settling near the driver's side door. Still alert. Still listening. Frank closed his eyes. For a while he only heard rain against the windshield. Then slowly another sound emerged beneath it. A faint metallic creaking somewhere outside. The antenna tower swaying in the storm. He drifted half asleep. and dreamed of helicopters burning against black water. Hours later, Frank woke violently, his heart hammered. The cab was freezing. For one disoriented second, he didn't know where he was. Then he heard it. A low growl. Shadow stood rigid in the passenger seat, not barking, not panicking. Growling silently toward the relay station. Specifically, toward the flooded basement below it. Frank followed the dog's stare through the rain-covered windshield. The basement windows glimmered faintly in the darkness, and for the briefest moment, he could have sworn a light moved beneath the water. Frank froze in the driver's seat. The rain hissed softly across the windshield, while Shadow stood rigid beside him, staring toward the basement windows of the relay station. Another flash of lightning rolled across the mountains. The faint glow vanished instantly. Darkness swallowed the building again. Frank rubbed both hands across his face slowly. "You're tired," he muttered to himself. Exhaustion could do strange things to the brain. So could trauma, especially in the dark. But Shadow was still staring. The dog's low growl vibrated deep in his chest. Not fear. Warning. Frank reached for the flashlight beneath the seat. The moment he touched the handle, Shadow stopped growling and jumped down from the truck before Frank even opened the door. Cold mountain air hit hard enough to sting his lungs. Fog drifted through the trees in pale ribbons, while the relay station loomed above the ridge like an old bunker left behind after the end of the world. Frank followed the dog toward the building. Mud pulled at his boots. The flashlight beam bounced across broken fencing and wet concrete. Somewhere down in the valley below, creek water crashed endlessly through darkness. Shadow moved ahead with quiet certainty. He didn't hesitate once. The dog already knew the route. Inside, the relay station felt colder than before. Wind moved softly through broken windows somewhere upstairs, creating a faint hollow whistle that echoed down the corridors. Frank swept the flashlight across the hallway. Peeling paint, rust streaks, military signage fading into concrete walls. Shadow went straight to the basement door again. He stopped at the top of the stairs. Watching. Frank descended slowly. Water reflected pale light back into his face as he reached the final dry step. The basement remained black and motionless. Nothing glowing now. Nothing moving. Only water. He crouched carefully and aimed the flashlight across the flooded room. Floating debris drifted near the far wall. Old shelves, plastic containers, a broken chair. Then the beam landed briefly on something metallic beneath the surface. A shape. Circular. Frank narrowed his eyes, too deep to identify clearly. Shadow suddenly let out a sharp bark. The sound exploded through the basement so violently, Frank nearly lost his footing. "Easy!" But the dog ignored him completely. Shadow descended one step farther until icy water touched his paws. Then he began scratching furiously at the concrete wall beside the staircase. Not random scratching, focused, specific. Frank moved closer. The beam of the flashlight revealed faint markings painted onto the wall just above the waterline. Most had faded away, but one line remained visible beneath layers of mildew and age. Authorized personnel only. Below it, a military symbol Frank recognized immediately. Navy Emergency Operations insignia. His stomach tightened. What the hell was Earl doing up here? Shadow whined now. Urgent. The dog scratched at the wall again. Frank reached down carefully and ran his fingers across the concrete. Something felt wrong about it. The texture changed near the lower corner. Not smooth concrete. Metal. A steel panel hidden beneath years of grime. Interesting. Frank shined the flashlight downward. The panel disappeared beneath the floodwater, completely submerged. Thunder rolled overhead again. Shadow backed away from the water suddenly and pressed against Frank's leg. Frank understood immediately. The dog didn't want to stay down there. Not tonight. Yeah, he muttered quietly. Me neither. Back upstairs, Frank barricaded the front entrance with an old metal desk he found in one of the offices. Not because he expected anyone. Old habits, perimeter security, entry control, escape routes. A seal's brain never really stopped working that way. He found a relatively dry office on the second floor and laid both blankets across the floor near the wall. Shadow circled twice before lying directly beside the doorway. Guard position. Frank smiled faintly despite himself. Still on duty, huh? The dog rested his head on his paws, but kept his eyes open. Frank lay staring at the stained ceiling while rain hammered the roof overhead. Sleep didn't come easily. It never did anymore, especially in unfamiliar places, especially after nightmares. His body eventually relaxed anyway, exhaustion dragging him downward in pieces. And then, gunfire. Frank jerked awake violently. Men shouting, smoke, a helicopter spinning out over black ocean water. He sat upright instantly, breathing hard. Darkness surrounded him. Not Iraq, not the Gulf, the relay station, rain, mountains. Shadow was already there. The dog had climbed beside him during the episode and pressed his body against Frank's chest before the panic could fully take hold. Frank shut his eyes tightly. The shame always came afterward. Not fear, shame. A Navy SEAL shouldn't wake up gasping at shadows after all these years. But trauma didn't care about rank, or medals, or age. Shadow licked once against Frank's wrist, grounding him again. You're wasted on me, dog, Frank whispered. The Malinois stayed beside him until dawn. Morning arrived gray and cold. Fog blanketed the mountains so heavily, the valley below disappeared completely. Frank stood outside the station drinking stale gas station coffee from a paper cup, while Shadow patrolled the edge of the property. The dog moved differently in daylight. More confident. Almost relieved. Frank studied the relay station carefully for the first time. The structure had originally been built into the mountainside itself. Thick reinforced walls disappeared directly into bedrock along the northern edge. Drainage pipes ran down toward the valley below, though most looked badly damaged now. Something about the architecture bothered him, too reinforced for communications alone. Military relay stations existed everywhere during the Cold War, but this place looked designed to survive a siege or hide something. Shadow barked suddenly from near the tree line. Frank followed the sound. An older man stood beyond the collapsed fence holding a gas can in one hand. Tall, broad shoulders, gray beard. A heavy canvas coat hung from his frame despite the damp morning air. The man looked at Frank cautiously. You Dalton? Frank nodded once. The man crossed the muddy yard slowly. Name's Wade Mercer, he said. House sits across the creek about a mile west. His handshake was rough and powerful. Construction hands. Working man hands. I saw lights up here last night, Wade continued. Didn't think anybody'd come back after Earl passed. Frank glanced toward the station. Did you know my brother well? Wade shrugged slightly. About as well as anybody knew Earl, meaning not much. Frank almost smiled at that. Fair enough. Wade handed over the gas can. Figured you might need this. Frank frowned. I can pay. No offense, Wade interrupted gently, but you don't look like a man swimming in extra cash. Frank looked away. Humiliation flickered hot in his chest. Wade seemed to realize it immediately. Wasn't an insult, he said quietly. Just truth. After a moment, Frank accepted the gas can. Appreciate it. Wade studied the relay station with narrowed eyes. You staying here? For now. County'll hate that. Why? They've wanted this mountain cleaned out for years. Frank looked at him carefully. Why? Wade hesitated. That's the funny part. He pointed toward the valley. Land down there ain't worth much. Too steep, too wet. Roads wash out every winter. Then why bother? Wade rubbed his beard slowly. Private companies kept sniffing around anyway. Survey crews, developers, men in suits. He shrugged. Earl always ran them off. Frank glanced toward the station again. Developers wanted this? Offered him cash 6 different times I know about. How much? Last offer was over 200 grand. Frank stared at him. For this dump? That's what bothered Earl too. Wind moved through the trees around them. Shadow suddenly emerged from behind the station, carrying something in his mouth. The dog trotted directly toward Frank and dropped the object at his feet. A rusted metal tag attached to an old chain. Frank bent down slowly. The moment he wiped mud away, his stomach tightened. Military Working Dog Unit. U.S. Navy. Below that, Shadow. Active search and rescue. Frank looked at the Malinois. The dog stood motionless, watching him. You worked down there, didn't you? Frank asked quietly. Shadow's ears twitched. Wade frowned. Dog keeps going near the basement? All night. Wade's expression darkened slightly. That flooding started about 5 years ago. Natural? Thought so at first. Wade looked toward the mountains. Then the creek changed direction. Frank looked up sharply. What? Whole water flow shifted after some survey crews blasted part of the ridge south of here. Couple months later, the basement started filling. Frank's military instincts sharpened immediately. Survey crews, developers, flooding, too many coincidences. Shadow suddenly turned and ran back toward the station entrance. Fast, urgent. Frank and Wade exchanged a glance before following. Inside, the dog went directly toward the basement stairs again. This time he barked aggressively. Echoes exploded through the flooded chamber below. Frank hurried down after him. Shadow stood at the final dry step, staring into the black water. Then the dog began clawing wildly at something beneath the surface near the wall. Mud swirled upward. For one brief second, Frank saw it clearly beneath the waterline. A steel hatch, reinforced, military grade, and someone had welded it shut from the outside. Frank crouched at the edge of the flooded stairwell while muddy water swirled around Shadow's paws below. The steel hatch sat just beneath the surface, half buried in silt and darkness. Thick weld lines crossed the seams like scars. Not old rust either, cleaner, more recent. Wade let out a low whistle behind him. That ain't normal. Frank didn't answer immediately. His pulse had changed, the same feeling he used to get before entering compounds overseas. Not fear, recognition. Someone had sealed that hatch deliberately, and whatever sat behind it mattered enough to bury underwater. Shadow barked sharply again. The sound bounced off the concrete walls and vanished into the flooded darkness below. Frank slowly rose to his feet. We need the water out. Wade looked at him like he'd lost his mind. That basement's been flooding for years. Then we start pumping. With what? Frank glanced toward the old relay station above them. With whatever still works. Rain continued outside through most of the morning. Cold mountain rain that soaked through clothes and settled into bone. Frank spent the next 2 hours searching the relay station room by room, while Shadow followed closely beside him. Most of the building was stripped clean or destroyed by moisture. Broken filing cabinets, collapsed ceiling tiles, mold-covered desks. But in what had once been the maintenance room near the back corridor, Frank found something useful. An old diesel backup generator. Massive. Military issue. Dust coated every inch of it, but the machine itself remained intact beneath the grime. Wade crouched beside it. Well, I'll be damned. Frank checked the fuel lines carefully. Battery's dead. Probably been dead 10 years. Engine still looks sealed. Wade looked over at him. You really think this'll run? Frank gave a small shrug. I've seen worse start in war zones. For the first time since arriving at Black Hollow Ridge, Wade smiled slightly. Together they spent the afternoon dragging tools from storage rooms and clearing debris around the generator. Shadow moved constantly between them and the basement stairs, like a soldier monitoring two positions at once. Every few minutes, the dog returned to stare into the water again. Waiting. Always waiting. By late afternoon, Frank's hands were shaking from exhaustion. Not weakness. Memory. The metallic smell of diesel fuel mixed too easily with older smells buried deep inside him. Burning vehicles, hot steel, smoke. His breathing tightened. He wiped grease from his fingers and forced himself to focus on the generator instead. Mechanical steps, simple steps. That was how you survived bad memories, one task at a time. Wade handed him a wrench. You all right? Fine. You don't look fine. Frank tightened a bolt harder than necessary. Didn't ask for an evaluation. Wade studied him quietly, then nodded once. Fair enough. The older man walked toward the doorway and pretended not to notice Frank's hands trembling. That small act of dignity stayed with Frank longer than he expected. By sunset, they finally had the fuel lines cleaned. Frank climbed into the generator compartment with a flashlight clenched between his teeth while rain drummed softly overhead. Try ignition, he called. Wade flipped the switch. Nothing. Again. The engine coughed once. Again. Another violent sputter echoed through the room before the generator suddenly roared alive in a cloud of black smoke. The entire relay station vibrated. Old overhead lights flickered weakly in distant hallways. Frank stepped back out coughing. Wade laughed. A real laugh. Thought that thing was dead. Military build's ugly, Frank muttered. Ugly survives. Shadow barked once sharply as if approving the noise. Frank found two industrial sump pumps still boxed in a lower storage room beside coils of heavy rubber hose. The equipment looked ancient, but functional. Wade frowned while helping carry them downstairs. You think Earl was trying to drain the basement himself? Frank glanced toward the flooded chamber. Looks that way. The idea bothered him deeply. Earl alone down here, fighting water in silence, just him and the dog. The pumps splashed into the floodwater with heavy mechanical thuds. A moment later, the hoses jerked violently as muddy water surged upward. Then finally, movement. Brown floodwater blasted out through broken basement windows and poured downhill into the storm ditch outside. Shadow immediately sat beside the staircase again, watching, like he'd been waiting years to hear those pumps start. Night settled heavily over the mountains. The fog thickened until the outside world vanished completely beyond the relay station walls. Inside, the steady hum of generators echoed through the building, while water slowly drained inch by inch from the basement. Frank sat against the hallway wall near the stairs, rubbing warmth back into stiff hands. Every muscle hurt. Wade handed him a thermos. Coffee. Frank accepted it carefully. The coffee was terrible. He drank it anyway. They sat listening to the pumps for several minutes before Wade finally spoke. You were really a SEAL? Frank stared toward the dark hallway. For a while. You see combat? Frank took another drink. Enough. Wade nodded slowly. Didn't push. Another thing Frank appreciated. Most civilians either glorified veterans or avoided them completely. Wade treated it like weather. Real, heavy, best respected quietly. Shadow suddenly stood, ears forward. The dog moved toward the basement stairs again and stared downward into the slowly receding water. Frank followed him, The waterline had dropped maybe 4 inches already. Not much, but enough to reveal more of the submerged wall. The steel hatch became clearer now beneath the surface. Large, rectangular, and definitely reinforced. Frank crouched beside Shadow. The dog's body vibrated with focus. "What's down there?" Frank whispered. Shadow looked briefly toward him, then back toward the hatch. The answer felt strangely close. Hours later, Wade finally left to check on his property across the creek. "Back at sunrise," he said before heading into the fog. Frank nodded once. "You don't have to keep helping." "Yeah," Wade replied. "I know." Then he disappeared into the darkness. The relay station felt enormous after he left. Too quiet. The generators hummed steadily below while rain tapped softly against broken windows upstairs. Frank tried sleeping in the office again. It didn't work. His body refused rest. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw floodwater, saw men underwater, saw faces he'd spent 30 years trying not to remember. At around 2 in the morning, he finally gave up and walked the hallways instead. Shadow stayed beside him, always beside him. The dog's nails clicked softly against concrete floors as they moved through the dead station together. Frank paused in one of the upstairs rooms overlooking the valley. Moonlight occasionally broke through the clouds, silvering the mountains beyond the trees. Beautiful country. Lonely country. The kind of place a man disappeared on purpose. Frank suddenly understood why Earl stayed here. Out in the world, people asked questions. Out here, the mountains let you keep your ghosts in peace. A sharp metallic bang echoed from downstairs. Frank froze instantly. Combat instincts hit before thought. Shadow spun toward the hallway with a low growl. Another sound followed. Clang. Like steel shifting against steel. The basement. Frank grabbed the flashlight and moved fast down the corridor, despite the pain in his knees. Shadow raced ahead. The pumps still roared below. Water continued draining steadily, but something had changed. Frank reached the basement doorway and stopped cold. The waterline had dropped enough to fully expose the top half of the steel hatch. And now, the hatch door stood open 3 inches. Shadow barked violently. Frank swept the flashlight beam across the opening. Blackness stared back from beneath the waterline. Then something drifted slowly upward through the gap. A weatherproof military document case, floating toward the surface. Frank stared at it through the flashlight beam, while muddy water churned around the opening in the steel hatch below. Shadow barked again. Sharp. Urgent. The case bumped softly against the flooded stairwell wall. Frank descended another step into the freezing water without thinking. Pain shot instantly through his knees, but he ignored it and reached for the floating container. Heavy plastic. Military issue. Sealed tight. He carried it back upstairs carefully, while Shadow followed so close their legs nearly touched. The generators hummed steadily behind them. Outside, wind battered the mountainside. Frank set the case down on an old metal table beneath one of the basement lights. Water dripped from his sleeves while he examined the latches. U.S. Navy Emergency Response Unit. The faded lettering was barely visible beneath years of grime. Wade would lose his mind when he saw this. Frank flipped the locks open slowly. The seal broke with a wet, sucking sound. Inside sat 3 waterproof notebooks, a folded topographic map, a rusted key ring, and a photograph sealed inside plastic. Frank picked the photograph up first. The image showed Earl standing beside Shadow, years younger and leaner. Both of them posed in front of the relay station before the flooding started. Behind them stood 3 teenagers wrapped in emergency blankets. Rescue survivors. Earl wasn't smiling, but Shadow was. Frank stared at the photo a long moment. His older brother had always hated cameras. The fact he kept this picture at all meant something. Frank carefully opened the first notebook. The handwriting hit him immediately. Earl's blocky military print. Simple, precise, efficient. May 14, 2009, located missing hiker approximately 4 miles east of Black Hollow Creek after thermal sweep with shadow. Severe hypothermia. Transported to County EMS at 02:17 hours. Frank turned the page slowly. Another rescue, then another. Missing children, lost hunters, overdose victims hidden in abandoned cabins, old veterans wandering the mountains during winter storms. Every entry carried the same calm detail. Coordinates, weather, condition of survivors. And always, shadow located subject. Shadow tracked blood trail. Shadow refused to leave victim. Frank sat heavily in the chair beside the table. The room suddenly felt much quieter. For years, he'd pictured Earl alone up here, wasting away in isolation. But Earl hadn't been hiding. He'd been working. Shadow nudged Frank's hand softly. The old seal rubbed the dog's neck absently while turning more pages. The entries stretched back decades, entire lives hidden inside those notebooks. One page stopped him cold. October 3rd, 2017, delivered emergency fuel and heating supplies to widow on Route 19 before Stormfront arrived. Left anonymously. Frank frowned slightly. That sounded exactly like Earl. Another page. March 11th, 2018. Transferred payment toward Claire Dalton oncology account through Knox County Veterans Fund. Frank froze. The basement seemed to tilt sideways around him. Claire, his wife. He read the line again. Transferred payment toward Claire Dalton oncology account. His chest tightened painfully. Claire's treatments had cost everything they owned. Savings, retirement, the house. Frank remembered sitting awake at hospital billing offices at 2 a.m. trying to figure out how to keep paying for another month of medication. Somehow the bills occasionally dropped. Random assistance programs, anonymous veteran charities. That's what the hospital always told him. Not charity. Earl. The realization hit like a physical blow. His older brother had been helping the entire time, without ever saying a word. Frank shut the notebook slowly. Shadow rested his head against Frank's knee. For a long moment, the only sound was the pumps draining water below them. Frank swallowed hard. "Damn you, Earl," he whispered. Not anger, grief, deep and old, the kind that arrived too late to fix anything. Outside, dawn slowly began creeping through the storm clouds. Gray mountain light filtered through cracked basement windows, while the waterline continued dropping inch by inch. By morning, Wade returned carrying a toolbox and a paper sack filled with biscuits from a diner somewhere down in the valley. The moment he stepped inside, he saw Frank sitting beside the open notebooks. Something happened. Frank slid the photograph across the table silently. Wade picked it up carefully. His expression shifted. "I'll be damned. He was running rescues out of here. For who?" Frank gestured toward the notebooks. "For everybody." Wade sat down heavily. The old firefighter turned pages slowly while reading Earl's records. The deeper he got, the quieter he became. "You know how many folks disappear in these mountains every year?" Wade asked eventually. "Too many. County Sheriff's Department barely covers half these ridges." He looked around the basement. Earl built his own operation. Frank nodded once. Wade turned another page, then another. Finally, he stopped. "Frank." He rotated the notebook carefully. One entry had been underlined twice. August 22nd, 2021 County Survey crews returned. Shadow alerted before sunrise. Men inspected North Ridge drainage systems near Old Creek Line. Equipment markings linked to Blackwater Development holdings. Wade frowned immediately. That's the company. What company? The developers trying to buy this place. Frank's eyes narrowed. Wade pointed toward the notebook. Blackwater Holdings. The name felt wrong instantly. Corporate. Cold. Frank flipped ahead several pages. September 2nd, 2021 creek diverted another 6 feet west overnight after excavation work upstream. Water entering lower foundation faster than pumps can remove it. Another entry. October 11th, 2021 flooding, no longer accidental. Frank looked up slowly. The basement suddenly felt colder. Wade rubbed a hand across his jaw. You think somebody flooded this place on purpose? Frank stared toward the dark water below. I think Earl believed they did. Shadow suddenly stood. The dog barked once toward the submerged hatch again. Frank followed his gaze. The waterline had dropped significantly overnight. Enough now to reveal the entire hatch door. Thick steel hinges, reinforced frame, military engineering. Wade whistled softly. That thing belongs on a submarine. Frank approached carefully. The welded seams had cracked when water pressure shifted during drainage. Rust flaked away from the edges as he gripped the heavy handle. It wouldn't budge. Help me! Together they pulled. The hatch groaned loudly. Metal screamed against metal. Then suddenly, movement. The door jerked open another foot. A blast of cold air surged upward from beneath the floor. Dry air. Not flooded. Frank and Wade exchanged a look instantly. Impossible. Everything below should have been underwater. Shadow pushed between them before either man could stop him. The Malinois slipped through the hatch opening and disappeared into darkness beneath the floor. Shadow! Frank dropped to one knee and aimed the flashlight downward. Concrete stairs, narrow, steep, descending deep into the mountain itself. Not flooded, not damaged, dry. The beam disappeared into blackness below. Frank's military instincts sharpened instantly. Hidden bunker, ventilated, sealed, protected from water. Someone had engineered this deliberately. Wade looked pale now. Earl never told anybody about this? No. You think there's more down there? Shadow barked once from below. Echoes rolled upward through the hidden stairwell. Frank took the flashlight tighter in his hand. Every part of him knew he should wait. Rest. Plan. Prepare. But another part, the old operator buried beneath years of exhaustion and grief, was already moving. He descended the first step slowly. Then another. Cold mountain air flowed upward from the darkness below, carrying a strange scent. Oil. Dust. And faintly, wood smoke. The stairwell curved deep into the bedrock beneath the relay station. The walls changed gradually from rough concrete to carved stone reinforced with old steel beams, hand-built, carefully hidden. Shadow waited farther below in complete silence, watching them descend. Frank counted automatically as they moved downward. 10 steps, 15, 20. Then finally the stairwell opened into darkness so vast the flashlight beam couldn't fully reach the opposite wall. Frank stopped breathing for half a second. The underground chamber stretched beneath the mountain like something buried during another lifetime. Maps covered the walls. Military radios lined steel shelves. Generators sat silent beside stacked fuel drums. Heavy rescue harnesses hung beside climbing gear and medical packs. Dozens of weatherproof filing cabinets stood in organized rows across the room. At the center sat a long operations table covered in faded topographic maps of the Smoky Mountains, and beside the table, a row of old K9 harnesses hanging perfectly clean and preserved. Shadow walked directly toward them, then slowly lay down beneath the operations table like a soldier finally returning to his post. Wade whispered the words Frank couldn't. My God. Frank swept the flashlight across the underground room in stunned silence. Someone hadn't just hidden a bunker beneath this mountain. Someone had built an entire rescue command center beneath the flooded relay station, and Earl Dalton had protected it for decades. Frank stood motionless at the bottom of the hidden staircase while the flashlight beam drifted slowly across the underground chamber. The room felt untouched by time, not abandoned, preserved. Dust floated lazily through cold air, carrying faint smells of diesel fuel, machine oil, old paper, and something else underneath it all. Wood smoke, as if Earl had stepped out only moments ago. Shadow remained beneath the operations table, calm now for the first time since arriving at Black Hollow Ridge. The Malinois rested his head between his paws and watched Frank quietly. Home. The dog had brought him home. Wade moved farther into the chamber with careful steps. "You know how crazy this is?" he whispered. Frank barely heard him. His attention stayed fixed on the walls. Large topographic maps covered nearly every surface. Colored pins marked remote sections of the Smoky Mountains across Tennessee and North Carolina. Beside them hung handwritten coordinates, weather charts, emergency frequencies, and search grids dating back years. One entire wall displayed photographs, dozens of them. Men, women, children. Most looked exhausted, cold, injured, but alive, rescued. Frank walked toward the photographs slowly. Underneath each image, Earl had written a name and date in black marker. Located. January 2008, found near Eagle Creek. Hypothermia transported safe. Another, runaway recovered, age 14. No family contact requested, safe shelter provided. And another, veteran recovered after 5 days missing. PTSD episode, safe return. Frank stared at the final note for a long moment. PTSD episode. His throat tightened. Earl understood. Not from books, not from headlines, from living with it. The underground chamber stretched farther than either man first realized. Beyond the operations area sat rows of steel shelving packed with supplies, medical kits, blankets, water purification units, portable radios, climbing ropes, fuel canisters, everything organized with military precision. Wade opened one cabinet carefully. Inside sat dozens of neatly labeled folders, search records, every rescue documented, every survivor remembered. "My God," Wade whispered again. Frank moved toward a smaller desk near the back wall. An old green banker's lamp sat beside a stack of leather-bound journals tied together with faded parachute cord. Earl's handwriting covered the top journal. Field records. Frank sat down slowly and untied the cord. The leather creaked softly beneath his hands. Inside, the pages were filled with tight military print. Notebooks from a lifetime. The first entry dated back nearly 30 years. March 4th, 1994, storm swept through Eastern Ridge overnight. Located missing father and daughter inside collapsed hunting cabin. Child stable. Father severe blood loss. Shadow tracked scent nearly 6 miles through snow. Frank stopped. "Shadow?" Wade leaned closer. "That dog ain't old enough." Frank turned pages quickly. Another entry. Another. Then he understood. Not one dog. Several. Different generations. Every rescue dog had carried the same name. Shadow. A line of working dogs passed down through decades beside Earl. The realization hit him unexpectedly hard. Earl had built an entire life up here. A mission. A purpose. While Frank spent years drifting from job to job after retirement, trying to outrun ghosts that never stopped following him. Shadow suddenly rose and walked toward another hallway, branching deeper into the mountain. The dog stopped there and looked back, waiting. Frank followed. The secondary hallway led into a communications room lined with old military radios and weather equipment. Dust coated most surfaces, but several systems still blinked faint green beneath emergency power. Wade let out a low whistle. This place could coordinate a damn war. Frank touched one of the radio consoles gently. Military-grade emergency frequencies, encrypted channels, long-range communication arrays. Earl had built a hidden rescue network beneath the Smokies, using equipment the government probably forgot existed decades ago. Then Frank noticed something sitting beside the radios. Dog tags, several sets. He picked one up carefully. Not military issue. Rescue volunteers, mountain deputies, former medics, retired servicemen, a quiet network of forgotten people helping forgotten people. One tag made his chest tighten. J. Dalton, his own initials. Frank frowned. That's mine. Wade looked over. What? Frank turned the tag in his hand slowly. It was old, scratched, familiar. Then memory hit him. Years ago, after returning home from overseas, Frank had thrown his old volunteer rescue badge and tag into a box during one of his darker nights. He remembered Earl visiting shortly after. The tag must have disappeared then. Earl had kept it. Why? Before Frank could think further, Shadow barked once from the far end of the hallway. The dog stood beside a heavy steel cabinet built into the rock wall. Unlike everything else underground, this cabinet remained locked. A thick combination wheel secured the door. Frank stepped closer. On the front, someone had scratched words into the metal with a knife. For the ones they stopped looking for, the hairs rose along Frank's arms. Wade looked uneasy now. You think we should open that? Frank studied the cabinet carefully. No. Wade blinked. No? Not yet. The old firefighter nodded slowly. He understood immediately. A room like this deserved respect, not curiosity. Frank returned to the journals instead. Hours passed underground while storm clouds drifted over the mountains above. The deeper he read, the more Earl transformed before his eyes. The brother Frank remembered had always been quiet, distant, a little strange after Vietnam. But these journals revealed someone else entirely, a man who never stopped serving. One entry described rescuing a veteran living in an abandoned trailer during winter. Another detailed searching flooded roads for trapped families after mudslides. Another recorded delivering anonymous grocery money to laid-off miners in nearby towns. Always anonymous, always quiet, always moving on before anyone could thank him. Frank reached a journal from 2019 and froze again. June 14th, 2019. Transferred additional funds toward Claire Dalton treatment account. Frank doesn't know, better that way. Frank lowered the notebook slowly. Claire. Even now he could see her near the hospital window, wrapped in blankets too thin for how cold she always felt near the end. She'd cried once after a treatment bill arrived because she thought she was destroying Frank financially. He spent hours convincing her she wasn't, all while Earl quietly paid what he could from the mountains. Frank bowed his head. Grief arrived differently with age, softer maybe, but deeper, like water wearing through stone. Shadow approached silently and rested his head against Frank's shoulder. The warmth of the dog pulled him back before the memories swallowed him completely. You knew, didn't you? Frank whispered. Shadow blinked slowly. Wade pretended not to notice Frank wiping his eyes. Outside, thunder faded gradually toward distant ridges. The storm was moving on. By evening, the pumps upstairs had lowered the floodwater enough to expose more of the basement floor above them. Frank climbed back up to check the generators, while Wade remained below cataloging equipment. The relay station felt different now, less haunted. Not because the ghosts were gone, because he finally understood what they were protecting. Sunset burned faint orange through the fog outside the broken windows. The mountains beyond the ridge glowed softly beneath drifting clouds. Frank stood alone beside the generators, listening to water drain from the basement. Then he noticed something strange near the far wall. A stack of old supply crates partially hidden beneath mud. He moved closer. Military transport cases, each stamped with faded government markings. One sat broken open. Inside were emergency blankets and medical supplies. But beneath them, cash. Bundles of it sealed inside waterproof bags. Frank stared in disbelief. Not millions. Not treasure. Emergency money. Funds Earl used for rescues and anonymous help. A handwritten note sat taped to the inside lid. If you're reading this, people still need help more than they need explanations. Frank closed the crate slowly. His older brother had spent 40 years turning this hidden station into something bigger than himself. Not for recognition, not for praise, for duty. The same reason men stood watch at sea in freezing rain. The same reason rescue teams entered storms everyone else fled from. Some people simply couldn't stop serving once they'd learned how. Footsteps echoed softly behind him. Wade emerged from the stairwell carrying another journal. You need to see this. Frank took it carefully. The page Wade opened to was dated only 3 years earlier. October 11th, 2021, flooding no longer accidental. Survey crews returned again today. Shadow alerted before sunrise. Water entering lower chamber faster than pumps can handle. Below that, if they drown this place, the records die with it. Frank kept reading. I can lose the station. I can lose the equipment. But not the names. His eyes moved lower. The final line had been underlined twice. Too many men came home from war only to disappear afterward. Somebody has to keep looking for them. Silence settled heavily between the two men. Far below them underground, Shadow barked once. Not warning. Calling. Frank looked toward the hidden stairwell descending back into the mountain, then slowly closed the journal. For the first time since arriving at Black Hollow Ridge, he understood something clearly. Earl hadn't left him a ruined relay station. He'd left him a mission. The realization stayed with Frank long after the generators quieted for the night. Outside, the storm had finally passed. Cold moonlight spilled across Black Hollow Ridge, silvering the wet pine trees and the broken antenna tower leaning above the mountain like a rusted skeleton. Frank stood alone on the porch of the relay station with a blanket around his shoulders and a cup of burned coffee warming his hands. Below the ridge, creek water roared through darkness. Shadow lay beside the doorway, watching the woods with half-closed eyes. The dog finally looked peaceful. For the first time since arriving at the station, Frank no longer felt like a trespasser. He felt chosen. That frightened him more than he wanted to admit, because missions came with responsibility, and responsibility meant failure mattered. Frank had spent years avoiding responsibility after retirement. Too many funerals, too many names carved into stone walls, too many nights waking up convinced somebody died because of him. Claire used to say he carried guilt like other men carried wallets. Always close, always heavy. The mountain air smelled sharp and wet after the rain. Fog drifted slowly through the valley while distant owls called somewhere in the trees. Wade stepped outside carrying another stack of journals. You ought to sleep. Frank shook his head slightly. Not tired. That's a lie. Frank gave the older man a tired glance. Wade sat beside him anyway. The wooden porch groaned beneath their weight. For several minutes, neither spoke. Men like them understood silence. Finally, Wade held one journal out. You missed this section earlier. Frank took it carefully. The notebook looked newer than the others. Water stains darkened several pages near the edges. Earl's handwriting appeared shakier here, older, more tired. Frank opened to the marked page. January 8th, 2021 survey crews returned with heavy equipment before sunrise. Shadow alerted from North Ridge Trail. They're not inspecting anymore. They're changing the land. Frank kept reading. February 2nd, 2021 creek no longer follows natural path. Water pressure against lower foundation increased again tonight. Pumps holding for now. Another entry farther down. March 14th, 2021 spoke to county office. They claim no permits exist for excavation near Black Hollow Creek. Someone's lying. Frank looked up slowly. Jesus. Wade nodded grimly. I checked old county records this afternoon while you were downstairs. You drove into town? Needed fuel anyway. Frank waited. Wade leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. There were development proposals filed 3 years ago for this entire valley. For what? Private wilderness resort. Wade spat into the dirt. Luxury cabins, fishing access, helicopter tours for rich tourists. Frank looked out toward the mountains. All this wilderness turned into vacation property. The thought made him sick. Blackwater Holdings? Wade nodded. They've been buying land quietly for years. Frank's jaw tightened. And Earl refused to sell. Looks that way. The wind shifted. Shadow lifted his head instantly and stared toward the tree line, alert again. Frank noticed it immediately. The dog's body language had changed. Focused. Listening. What is it? Shadow stood slowly, then growled. Low. Deep. Wade turned toward the woods. You expecting company? Frank rose carefully. No. The flashlight beam cut across wet grass and drifting fog. At first, Frank saw nothing, then movement. Far down the ridge road, headlights. A vehicle climbing toward the station. Shadow barked sharply. The approaching truck slowed near the collapsed fence but didn't stop immediately. Frank recognized the silver pickup before the driver even stepped out. Travis. His son climbed from the truck, wearing expensive hiking boots, already muddy from the road. A dark jacket covered his dress shirt, though the mountain air clearly made him uncomfortable. He looked around the ruined station with open disbelief. This place is worse than I remembered. Frank said nothing. Shadow moved protectively beside him. Travis noticed the dog and hesitated. That thing bite? He decides. Travis forced a laugh that died quickly. Wade stayed seated on the porch, watching quietly. What are you doing here? Frank finally asked. Travis shoved his hands into his jacket pockets. Megan called me. Frank frowned. Why? She said you disappeared into the mountains with a military dog and stopped answering your phone. I don't have a phone. Exactly. The silence between them stretched thin. Travis looked toward the relay station. You're seriously staying here? For now. Dad, Travis exhaled sharply. This place is condemned. Funny. Everybody keeps saying that. Because it's true. Shadow growled softly again. Travis glanced uneasily toward the dog. Then his eyes drifted toward the basement entrance. Water still down there? Some. You trying to drain it? Frank stared at him carefully now. Something about Travis's tone felt wrong. Too interested. Why? Just asking. Wade finally spoke from the porch. Funny thing about water, he said casually. Usually it follows the land naturally. Travis looked over sharply. And this creek didn't. Silence. Cold mountain silence. The kind that made truth feel heavier. Travis looked away first. I don't know what that means. Means somebody moved part of the ridge upstream, Wade replied. Heavy machinery, excavation work. Travis rubbed the back of his neck. Look, I consulted on a land survey out here a few years ago. That's all. Frank's stomach tightened instantly. What kind of survey? Potential development study. The air seemed to leave the porch all at once. Shadow stepped closer beside Frank, protective, watching Travis carefully now. You never mentioned that at the lawyer's office, Frank said quietly. Travis shrugged uneasily. Because it didn't matter. Seems like it matters now. I didn't flood the station, Dad. Frank hadn't accused him. Not yet. But the fact Travis answered that way anyway said enough. Wade rose slowly from the porch. You know Blackwater Holdings? Travis's face tightened almost imperceptibly. They hired my consulting firm once. For this valley? Yes. Frank looked at his son differently then. Not anger. Something sadder. Distance. The same distance that had been growing between them for years finally had a shape. Money. Convenience. A world where mountains only mattered if somebody could profit from them. You told them Earl was isolated, Frank said quietly. Travis hesitated. They already knew. But you confirmed it. No offense, Dad, but Uncle Earl was living alone in a condemned bunker with a dog. That bunker saved lives. Travis frowned. What are you talking about? Frank stared at him for a long moment, then turned toward the relay station. Come inside. The underground chamber changed Travis immediately. Frank saw it happen the second they descended the hidden staircase. The polished operations tables, the rescue records, the photographs lining the walls, the maps marked with decades of searches. Travis stopped halfway down the final stair. My God. Shadow walked ahead into the chamber and settled beneath the operations table again. Back at his post. Wade handed Travis one of Earl's journals silently. Travis flipped through pages slowly. The confidence drained from his face with every entry. Rescues, supply drops, anonymous aid, then the payment records. Cancer treatment support, emergency surgery assistance, veteran housing. Frank watched his son reading in silence, watched realization slowly crush him. He paid for Megan's boy's surgery, Frank said quietly. Travis looked up sharply. What? 3 years ago, through one of his rescue funds. That's impossible. Frank handed him another journal. Read. Travis sat heavily in one of the old metal chairs. The underground chamber suddenly felt painfully still. Only the distant hum of generators broke the silence. Eventually, Travis closed the notebook slowly. I didn't know. No, Frank replied. You didn't. Wade moved toward the far wall where newer journals sat stacked separately from the others. These are the last records Earl kept. Frank joined him. The final journals looked rougher than the rest. Several pages warped from moisture damage. The handwriting weaker, more urgent. Frank opened one carefully. April 7th, 2022. North wall cracked overnight. Floodwater entering lower storage rooms faster than expected. Shadow refuses to leave operations level. Another entry. May 2nd, 2022. Men returned after midnight. Heard machinery near Creekline again. Frank's pulse quickened. Then he reached the final pages. The words became shakier there, more personal, less like reports. September 18th, 2022. Water reached second stairwell landing tonight. Lost radio archive room. Shadow located remaining records before flooding. Another. October 1st, 2022. Can't keep water back forever now. Frank turned the page slowly. The final written entry covered only half the paper. If the water reaches the stairs, I hope Frank comes before Shadow is left alone. Silence swallowed the room. Even Wade looked away. Travis sat motionless beside the operations table, staring at nothing. Frank read the line again. I hope Frank comes before Shadow is left alone. Not save the station. Not save the records. Save the dog. Because Earl knew Shadow would stay. Loyal to the end. Frank suddenly understood why the Malinois never stopped watching the flooded basement, why he guarded the hatch, why he stayed at Black Hollow Ridge after Earl died. The dog wasn't protecting a bunker. He was protecting Earl's watch. Shadow slowly rose and crossed the room toward Frank, then gently pressed his head against Frank's hand. Frank closed the journal carefully. Outside, somewhere above them, creek water thundered through the mountain darkness, and for the first time since arriving at Black Hollow Ridge, Frank realized something even more frightening than the hidden rescue station beneath his feet. Someone had tried very hard to bury it forever. The underground chamber felt colder after that realization. Not physically, emotionally. Frank stood beside Earl's journals while Shadow rested at his boots, and Travis sat silently at the operations table with his elbows on his knees. The overhead lights hummed softly. Beyond the reinforced walls, mountain water rushed endlessly through the darkness above them. Wade broke the silence first. "We need proof." Frank looked up. "Proof of what?" "That somebody intentionally flooded this place." Travis rubbed both hands across his face tiredly. "You're talking like this is some conspiracy." Wade's expression hardened. "Creeks don't reroute themselves with excavation equipment." Frank watched his son carefully. Travis looked exhausted now. Smaller somehow. Not the confident businessman from Knoxville. Just a middle-aged man realizing the ground beneath his life might not be stable anymore. "I told you," Travis said quietly. "I only consulted on the development proposal." "What exactly did you tell them?" Frank asked. Travis hesitated too long. "That Earl wouldn't sell." Frank felt something tighten in his chest. And that he lived alone." Travis swallowed hard. "That the property would probably fall into foreclosure eventually." The room went silent again. Frank looked away before anger could fully rise, because beneath the anger sat disappointment, and disappointment hurt worse. Shadow stood suddenly. The Malinois moved toward the rear hallway of the underground chamber with his ears raised high, alert. Frank noticed immediately. "What is it?" The dog barked once and disappeared around the corner. Wade grabbed a flashlight. They followed. The hallway beyond the operations room narrowed into older stone corridors, reinforced with steel support beams. Emergency lights flickered weakly overhead, while water dripped somewhere deeper in the mountain. Shadow stopped outside a heavy metal door at the end of the corridor. The same locked room they'd found earlier. For the ones they stopped looking for. The words scratched into the steel seemed darker now beneath the flashlight beam. Shadow pawed once at the door, then looked directly at Frank. Waiting. Frank stepped closer. The thick combination wheel still sat locked in place. But this time he noticed something different. A small keyhole beneath the wheel. Military backup access. His hand instinctively reached into his pocket. The rusted keyring from the waterproof case upstairs. He slowly sorted through the keys until one caught the flashlight beam. Old brass. Military stamped. Without speaking, Frank slid it into the lock. The mechanism clicked immediately. Everyone froze. Even Travis stood. Frank turned the wheel slowly. Metal groaned deep inside the door. Then the lock released. The heavy steel door opened inward with a long, low creak. Cold air spilled from the darkness beyond. The room inside was smaller than the operations chamber, but far more personal. Memorial walls lined both sides. Photographs, dog tags, letters, military patches. Hundreds of names covered the walls in careful rows, some framed, some handwritten. Candles sat melted onto old shelves beside folded American flags. Shadow entered first. The dog walked calmly through the room as if he'd done it many times before. Frank stepped inside slowly. Every wall told a story. Missing veterans later found alive. Recovered hikers. Overdose survivors. teen runaways, families rescued during storms. Earl had remembered all of them. One section stopped Frank cold. Photographs of military men, most older, many scarred. Below each picture sat handwritten notes. Found after winter exposure. Safe suicide intervention. Successful recovered during PTSD episode. And then, 3 names marked differently, gold stars beside them. Frank stepped closer. These weren't rescue survivors. These were memorials. Veterans officially listed as missing for years before Earl found them dead in the mountains. One photograph showed a young Marine no older than 22 smiling beside a fishing boat. Another showed an older Army medic holding 2 children. Frank's chest tightened. Nobody knew these men except the families who never stopped searching. But Earl remembered them. Every one. Wade removed his hat slowly. My God. Travis looked pale now. This was all under the station? For years, Frank said quietly. Shadow stopped beside a shelf near the rear wall. The dog whined softly. Frank approached. A final journal sat there alone, newer than the others, its pages warped badly from moisture damage. The final journal. Frank opened it carefully. The handwriting inside looked weaker than ever. December 3rd, 2022, generators failing more often now. Water reached lower archive room tonight. Moved memorial records before flooding. Another entry. January 16th, 2023, Blackwater representatives returned. Offered final purchase agreement. Told them same answer as before. Then, Shadow alerted near creek line after midnight. Heard excavation equipment again. Frank turned another page. February 9th, 2023 North. Retaining wall collapsed. Flooding accelerated immediately afterward. His jaw tightened. That wasn't nature. Someone weakened the station intentionally. Then he reached the final written pages. March 1st, 2023, heart acting up again. Couldn't finish clearing drainage tunnel today. Shadow stayed beside me until sunrise. Another. March 11th, 2023. If records are lost, names disappear again. Can't allow that. Frank's hands shook slightly now. Not from age, from grief arriving piece by piece. Then something slipped from between the pages. A folded document. Official paper. Frank unfolded it carefully beneath the flashlight. Land acquisition contract. Blackwater Holdings. And near the bottom, consulting approval signatures. One signature belonged to Travis. The room went completely silent. Travis stared at the paper like he'd been punched. Dad? Frank didn't speak. Couldn't. Not yet. Wade slowly took the contract and read through it carefully. Then his face hardened. This survey approval included creek redirection permits. Travis looked stunned. What? You signed off on drainage modification access. I never read that section. That's your signature. I thought it was erosion control. Wade stared at him coldly. They rerouted mountain runoff directly toward the relay station. Travis backed away slightly. No. Frank finally looked at his son and saw real fear there now. Not fear of him. Fear of understanding what his choices caused. I didn't know, Travis whispered. The words echoed weakly through the memorial room. Frank believed him. That somehow made it worse, because evil would have been easier. Intentional cruelty would have been easier. But this? This was carelessness. Modern carelessness. The kind that destroys things quietly because nobody bothered asking what mattered before signing paperwork. Travis sat heavily against the wall beneath rows of memorial photographs. I thought it was abandoned, he said weakly. Frank stared at the contract, at the signatures, at the water stains spreading across Earl's final journal. Then finally he spoke. He was still standing watch. The words came out rough, quiet. He stayed here protecting people while everybody else treated this mountain like empty land. Travis lowered his head into his hands. Shadow crossed the room slowly and stopped beside Frank instead. Choosing his place, always choosing. Wade stepped toward another shelf near the rear wall. Frank? There was something strange in his voice. Frank turned. Wade held up a weatherproof folder labeled Active Case Files. Inside sat recent reports, only months old. The station hadn't stopped operating before Earl died. He'd still been searching for people almost until the end. One report described locating an elderly veteran suffering from dementia 2 counties over. Another detailed rescuing a teenage girl from an abandoned mining camp during winter. And then, the final active file. No date, no completed report. Only one handwritten line. Unknown male spotted near Lower Creek after dark, possible surveillance. Frank frowned. Surveillance? Shadow suddenly growled. Low. Dangerous. Every man in the room froze instantly. The dog wasn't looking at them. He was staring toward the hallway outside the memorial room. Then, a sound. Very faint. Metal scraping somewhere deeper in the relay station above them. Not the generators. Footsteps. Frank's military instincts ignited immediately. Every nerve sharpened. Someone was upstairs, and they weren't alone anymore. Frank killed his flashlight instantly. The underground memorial room dropped into darkness, except for the weak emergency bulbs glowing along the ceiling. Shadow's growl deepened. Every muscle in the dog's body locked tight. Wade moved beside the hallway entrance quietly, while Travis stood frozen against the wall, still clutching the soaked land contract. Another sound echoed faintly above them. Bootsteps. More than one set. Slow. Careful. Frank's body reacted before his mind fully caught up. Years of training slid back into place with terrifying ease. Angles, entrances, cover. He motioned silently toward the lights. Wade understood immediately and switched off the remaining overhead bulbs. Darkness swallowed the underground station completely. Only the faint hum of generators remained. Travis whispered shakily, "Who the hell is that?" Frank held up one hand. Silence. Above them, floorboards creaked somewhere inside the relay station. Then came the unmistakable sound of metal scraping against metal. The basement hatch. Someone had found it. Shadow took one silent step forward. Ready. Frank crouched beside the dog and placed one hand against his neck. Not yet. The old SEAL's heartbeat slowed instead of speeding up. Combat had always done that to him. The worse things became, the calmer he got. It was afterward that destroyed him. But right now his mind felt razor sharp. A flashlight beam suddenly sliced through the upper stairwell far above, moving slowly downward, searching. Frank leaned close to Wade. How many generators? 2 upstairs, 1 back up near the tunnel. Can you kill the main power? Wade nodded once and disappeared silently down the side corridor. Travis looked terrified now. Dad, quiet. The flashlight beam above reached the hidden stairwell entrance. A voice echoed faintly downward. You sure this is the place? Another voice answered. The old man kept records here. Search everything. Frank's jaw tightened instantly. Not random trespassers. They knew about the station. Shadow's growl became almost inaudible now. The dog stared upward with complete focus. Frank recognized the posture immediately. Working dog mode. the same posture military dogs used seconds before moving. Footsteps started descending the hidden stairs. 2 men at least, maybe more above. Frank positioned himself beside the stone wall near the bottom landing, while Travis crouched near the operations table, trying unsuccessfully to steady his breathing. The flashlight beams bounced wildly down the stairs now. Then one of the men spoke again. "Boss said clear the files and burn whatever's left." Burn. Frank's eyes narrowed. Not developers anymore. Clean up. Someone wanted the station erased completely. The first man reached the bottom stair. Heavy boots, dark rain jacket, flashlight in one hand. He never saw Frank move. Frank stepped from the darkness, grabbed the man's wrist, and slammed him hard against the stone wall. The flashlight clattered away across the floor. The second intruder shouted in shock, and Shadow exploded forward. The Belgian Malinois hit the man mid-step with terrifying force, driving him backward onto the stairs before he could even react. The flashlight spun wildly across stone walls and maps while boots scraped against concrete. "Shadow, hold!" The dog obeyed instantly, but remained locked onto the man's chest, teeth bared inches from his throat. Frank pinned the first intruder against the wall effortlessly, despite the pain screaming through his aging joints. The man smelled like diesel fuel and cigarettes. Not military. Private contractor. Wade suddenly killed the generators. Everything went black. Absolute darkness swallowed the underground station. Someone farther upstairs cursed loudly. Another flashlight beam flickered near the basement entrance above. More men. Frank dragged the intruder deeper into the chamber, while Shadow forced the second man downward under silent threat. "Who sent you?" Frank demanded quietly. The man didn't answer. Frank tightened his grip slightly. "Try again." "Blackwater," the man finally gasped. Travis looked physically ill now. The second intruder slowly raised both hands, while Shadow watched him with deadly focus. "We were told the place was abandoned." "Then why bring gasoline?" Wade asked from somewhere in the darkness. Silence. That answer told enough. Frank released the first man abruptly. "Get out." The intruder blinked. "What?" "Take your friend and leave this mountain." "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly." Frank stepped closer. And for one brief second, the old Navy SEAL everyone thought had disappeared beneath grief, and age returned completely. Cold eyes, still posture, controlled violence. The intruder saw it instantly. So did Travis. "You come back down those stairs again," Frank said quietly, "and this dog won't stop at warning you." Shadow growled softly on command. The two men backed toward the stairwell immediately, then hurried upward. Seconds later, truck engines roared somewhere above the relay station, fading fast down the mountain road. Darkness settled over the underground station again. Only everyone's breathing remained. Travis finally spoke first. "Oh my God." Frank leaned heavily against the operations table, suddenly exhausted. Adrenaline faded quickly at 68 years old. His knees shook, hands trembling now. The crash always came afterward. Shadow returned immediately and pressed against Frank's leg, grounding him again, always grounding him. Wade restarted the backup generator. Dim lights flickered slowly back to life across the chamber. The memorial room looked different now, more fragile somehow, as if the station itself understood it had narrowly survived something. Travis stared at his father with open disbelief. "You moved like—" He couldn't finish. Frank looked away. "Like somebody who spent too long doing bad things in dark places." Silence followed. Then unexpectedly, Travis asked quietly, "Did it ever stop?" Frank frowned slightly. "The war." The question hung heavily in the underground chamber. Frank sat slowly in one of Earl's old metal chairs. His body suddenly felt every year of his age. "No," he answered honestly. "Not really." Wade remained respectfully silent near the operations desk, while Shadow settled beside Frank's boots. The mountains help some, Frank continued quietly. Silence helps. Dogs help. He scratched absently behind Shadow's ears. But mostly, you just learn how to carry it. Travis looked down at the soaked contract still clenched in his hand. I didn't know any of this. Frank almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because that sentence described almost everyone Earl ever helped. Nobody knew. Nobody noticed. Until the damage was already done. Outside, thunder rolled faintly again somewhere beyond the ridges. A storm returning. Frank suddenly felt crushing exhaustion settle into his bones. He stood too quickly. The room tilted violently. For one terrifying second, he wasn't underground anymore. Rotor blades thundered overhead, men screaming through radio static. Floodwater rising black beneath a helicopter door. Frank stumbled hard against the wall. PTSD hit like lightning sometimes. No warning. No mercy. Dad! Travis moved toward him, but Frank shoved him away instinctively. Don't! His breathing turned ragged instantly. Sweat poured cold across his face. The underground chamber blurred around him. Not the Smokies. Not Earl's station. Combat. Water. Dead men underwater. Shadow reacted immediately. The Malinois rose and pressed directly against Frank's chest with firm, steady weight. The dog's paws braced against Frank's legs while he whined softly. Grounding pressure. Working dog training. Frank grabbed desperately onto the dog's harness. Easy, Wade said quietly from nearby. You're here, Frank. But Frank barely heard him. The panic surged harder. Then Shadow licked once across Frank's shaking hand. The simple, familiar sensation cut through the spiral just enough. Cold nose. Warm fur. Real. Not memory. Shadow stayed pressed against him until the shaking finally slowed. Minutes passed before Frank could breathe normally again. The room remained silent out of respect. Eventually, he sat heavily against the operations desk while Shadow settled beside him without moving an inch away. Travis looked shattered now. Not by the intruders. By this. Seeing his father break apart in front of him. I thought you were just angry all the time, Travis whispered. Frank stared toward the memorial wall. No, he said quietly. Mostly I was tired. Far above them, rain began falling again across Black Hollow Ridge. Steady mountain rain. The kind Earl probably listened to for decades while standing watch underground, beside a rescue dog and a room full of names nobody else remembered. Wade finally broke the silence softly. You know people are going to start hearing about this place now. Frank nodded slowly. The station had survived flooding, but secrets never survived forever. Then suddenly headlights swept briefly across the basement windows above, another vehicle approaching the mountain road. All three men looked upward instantly. Shadow rose again beside Frank. This time he didn't growl. Instead, the old Malinois walked slowly toward the operations wall covered in photographs and stopped beside one particular image. A missing child wrapped in a rescue blanket beside a sheriff's deputy. Footsteps echoed faintly upstairs again, but only one set this time. Slow, heavy, and familiar. Frank recognized the footsteps before the man even reached the hidden stairwell. Slow, measured, weighted by old injuries. A flashlight beam appeared above them. Then a voice drifted downward through the stone corridor. Shadow? The old Belgian Malinois barked instantly. Not warning. Recognition. A tall man in a sheriff's jacket descended carefully into the underground chamber, carrying his hat beneath one arm. Gray hair curled beneath the edges of the flashlight beam, while deep mountain lines cut across his face. The moment he reached the bottom step, He stopped cold. His eyes moved slowly across the operations room, the memorial walls, the rescue maps, the filing cabinets, then finally to Frank. "Well," the sheriff whispered softly, "I always knew Earl was hiding something." Shadow crossed the room immediately and pressed against the man's leg. The sheriff knelt with visible effort and scratched behind the dog's ears. "You old soldier," he murmured. Wade stepped forward. "Sheriff Coulter Hayes." Frank nodded once. The sheriff stood slowly again, his eyes never leaving the chamber. "I got a call from a deputy who saw unfamiliar trucks leaving Black Hollow about an hour ago." He looked toward Travis briefly. "Figured I better come check things myself." Travis looked away. Coulter noticed the tension immediately. Then his eyes landed on the memorial wall. Everything in his expression changed. He walked slowly toward one photograph near the center. A little girl wrapped in blankets beside a search helicopter. The same photograph Shadow had stopped beside earlier. Coulter touched the frame carefully. "That's Emily Watkins," he said quietly. "Missing in the blizzard back in 2009. Frank watched him closely. "Earl found her?" The sheriff nodded. "Whole county searched those mountains 3 days." His voice lowered. "We called off recovery operations after the second storm front moved in." Shadow sat beside Coulter silently. The sheriff scratched the dog's neck gently, but Earl kept searching anyway. He looked around the chamber slowly. "Didn't tell anybody." Frank felt something shift inside him hearing that. Another layer of Earl emerging from the dark. Coulter continued quietly. "Middle of the third night. This dog starts barking outside my station. Earl standing beside him covered in ice and snow, holding that little girl wrapped in his coat." The sheriff swallowed hard. She was still alive because Shadow found her trapped beneath a fallen pine. Shadow blinked slowly, as if he already remembered. Maybe he did. The room stayed silent a moment longer before Coulter finally turned toward Frank. "You know what your brother did up here?" "Starting to." The sheriff nodded toward the memorial walls. "Most folks around these mountains thought Earl was just some half-crazy veteran hiding from the world." His eyes drifted toward the photographs again. "Truth is, he was out there looking for the people everybody else stopped looking for." The words settled heavily into the chamber. Travis sat motionless at the operations table while Wade quietly organized journals nearby. Frank noticed his son staring at the memorial walls differently now. Not defensively. Ashamed. The sheriff eventually looked toward the soaked land contract still lying open on the table. His expression darkened. "You boys tied up with Blackwater Holdings?" Travis answered quietly. "I consulted on surveys." Coulter's jaw tightened. "Those people been circling this valley like vultures for years." "They flooded the station," Wade said bluntly. The sheriff looked at him sharply. "You got proof?" Frank handed him Earl's final journals. Coulter read several pages silently. The older sheriff's face hardened with every line. "Damn fools." He closed the notebook carefully. "County commissioners probably signed half those permits without ever stepping foot up here." Travis rubbed his eyes tiredly. "I didn't know what this place was." "No," Frank replied quietly. "You didn't ask." Silence again. Outside, rain hammered harder across the mountain ridge. Wind rattled somewhere through broken sections of the relay station above them. The underground chamber suddenly felt warmer by comparison. Safer. Like the mountain itself protected this hidden room. Then headlights appeared briefly through the upper stairwell windows. Another vehicle. Everyone looked up. This time it was a small SUV climbing carefully through mud toward the relay station. Travis stood immediately. "Megan." Frank frowned. A minute later, his daughter descended slowly into the underground station, wearing jeans, hiking boots, and a rain-soaked coat. She stopped dead halfway down the staircase. Unlike Travis, she didn't speak at first. She just stared at the walls, the maps, the rescue records, then finally at Frank. "Oh my God." Shadow walked calmly toward her and nudged her hand once. Megan knelt automatically to pet him, while tears already gathered in her eyes. "This dog," she whispered. Frank watched her carefully. "What is this place?" Frank answered simply. "Earl's life." Megan moved slowly through the chamber, touching framed photographs and old rescue gear, like someone walking through a church. Then she reached the memorial wall. Her hand suddenly froze against one particular photograph. A young boy smiling from a hospital bed. Her son. Eli. Megan stared at the picture in complete confusion. "What?" Below the photograph sat a handwritten note. "Cardiac surgery assistance. 2018 anonymous fund approved." Megan's face went pale. "No." Frank opened one of Earl's journals quietly and handed it to her. The marked page waited open already. April 18th, 2018. Transferred emergency payment through Veterans Outreach account for Eli Harper surgery. Megan doesn't need to know where it came from. Kid deserves a chance. Megan covered her mouth instantly. The room blurred through tears. "When Eli needed surgery," she whispered, "the hospital told us some donor program stepped in." Frank nodded once. It was Earl. Megan sat down hard in the nearest chair. Her shoulders shook silently. "He never even visited us." "He didn't need credit," Frank replied softly. The sheriff looked around the chamber slowly. "That old fool probably helped half this county without anybody knowing." Wade snorted quietly. "More than half." Megan wiped her eyes but couldn't stop staring at the photograph of her son. "He saved Eli." Frank looked toward Earl's journals. "He saved a lot of people." Outside, thunder rolled heavily across the mountains. The storm intensified. But underground, the station slowly began filling with something else now. Not secrecy. People. Connection. One by one, names tied themselves back to Earl's hidden work. The realization spread quietly through everyone standing there. This place mattered. Not because of the land, because of the lives attached to it. Coulter eventually removed his sheriff's hat completely. "You know what's going to happen if word gets out?" Frank looked at him. "What?" "People'll come." That proved true faster than anyone expected. The next morning, an old pickup truck appeared at the ridge before sunrise. Then another, and another. By noon, nearly a dozen people stood inside the relay station above ground, listening quietly while Wade explained the flooding and the hidden bunker beneath the mountain. Most came after hearing Coulter mention Earl's rescue records over police radio. Word traveled fast through mountain towns, especially stories involving forgotten kindness. Frank watched carefully from the porch while Shadow remained beside him. An older woman arrived carrying a casserole wrapped in towels. A retired paramedic came holding photographs. 2 volunteer firefighters drove 3 counties over after recognizing Earl's name. And each carried a story. "He paid our electric bill one winter after my husband died. Left groceries on our porch every Christmas. Helped my brother after he came home from Afghanistan. Found my daughter after she ran away." The stories kept coming. None of them knew the others existed. Earl had helped them separately, quietly, without ever connecting the dots. Frank felt overwhelmed listening to it all. Not because Earl had been extraordinary, because nobody noticed extraordinary things anymore unless somebody filmed them online first. But Earl never wanted attention. He wanted results. By afternoon, the underground station filled with visitors moving silently through the memorial walls and rescue records. Many cried openly. Others simply stood there, stunned. A retired Army medic named Walter Briggs stopped in front of one photograph and broke down completely. "That's me," he whispered. The photograph showed a thin, exhausted veteran sitting beside a fire wrapped in blankets. Walter wiped his face roughly. "I got lost up here after things got bad in my head." Frank understood immediately. "PTSD," Walter pointed toward Shadow. "This dog found me before the snow came." The old medic looked around the chamber in disbelief. "I spent 15 years trying to figure out who saved my life." Shadow rested calmly beneath the operations table while strangers quietly thanked a man already gone. By sunset, the underground station no longer felt hidden. It felt alive again. But one person still hadn't spoken all day. Travis. Frank found him alone near the memorial room, staring at Earl's final journal. "You okay?" Frank asked quietly. Travis laughed once bitterly. "No." He looked around the underground chamber slowly. "I thought I was helping develop dead land." Frank remained silent. Travis swallowed hard. "But this..." He looked toward the walls filled with names. "I helped drown all this." Frank studied his son carefully. Rain hammered above them, while voices echoed faintly upstairs where townspeople continued arriving with stories about Earl. Finally, Travis whispered, "How do you live with knowing you hurt people without meaning to?" Frank looked toward Shadow resting nearby, then toward Earl's memorial walls, and answered honestly, "Some days you don't." The underground station fell quiet around them. Then suddenly, Shadow stood again. The old Malinois walked slowly toward the operations desk at the center of the chamber. And beside Earl's faded chair, he lay down carefully, like a soldier returning to watch one final post. The underground chamber had gone quiet again by the time the last visitors left Black Hollow Ridge that evening. Rain still drifted softly through the mountains outside, though the storm had weakened into mist and cold wind whispering through pine trees. Frank stood alone beside the operations wall, watching headlights disappear down the muddy road one by one. The mountain felt different now, less abandoned. For years, Earl had protected the station in silence. Now people knew, and somehow the knowledge itself seemed to warm the place. Voices lingered in the walls, stories lingered, gratitude lingered. Shadow remained beneath Earl's old desk without moving, watching, always watching. Wade carried folding chairs back upstairs, while Sheriff Coulter headed into town to start digging through old permit records connected to Blackwater Holdings. That left only Frank and Travis underground, father and son, and years of distance between them. The generators hummed steadily somewhere deeper in the bunker, while water dripped slowly through old drainage pipes overhead. Frank sat at the operations table with Earl's final journal open in front of him. He hadn't turned another page in nearly 20 minutes. Travis stood near the memorial room doorway, staring at the names covering the walls. The silence between them stretched long enough to hurt. Finally, Travis spoke. "I used to think you hated me." Frank didn't look up immediately. "Hate takes energy." The words landed harder than anger would have. Travis swallowed. "When Mom got sick, you stopped talking to everybody." Frank leaned back slowly in the metal chair. "I was tired." "No," Travis said quietly. "You disappeared." The underground station suddenly felt smaller, closer. Frank rubbed one hand across his face. Age spots, scars, hands that shook more now than they used to. He looked old tonight, older than 68. "After Claire died," Frank said softly, "I'd wake up every morning surprised I was still breathing." Travis looked down. "I didn't know how bad it was." "You weren't supposed to." Frank stared toward the memorial walls. "You spend enough years training men to survive combat. You learn one thing fast." His voice lowered. "Nobody wants to hear how broken you feel afterward." Shadow lifted his head slightly beneath the desk, listening. Frank continued quietly. People thank veterans at football games, buy flags, shake hands. He gave a tired smile without humor. Then they expect you to go home and become normal again. The bunker lights flickered faintly overhead. But some things don't leave, Frank said. Some nights you still hear rotor blades in thunderstorms. Some nights you still count dead friends while trying to sleep. Travis sat slowly across from him. For the first time since arriving at Black Hollow Ridge, he looked less like a businessman and more like somebody's son again. You never told us. Frank laughed once quietly. How exactly do you explain drowning memories to people who weren't there? The words hung heavy between them. Travis looked toward Shadow. That dog saved you tonight. Frank nodded once. He's been saving men longer than either of us realized. Shadow's tail moved once against the floor. The old Malinois looked tired now, older. Gray spreading around his muzzle beneath the dim underground lights. Frank suddenly realized Shadow was aging faster than he wanted to admit. Another thing time was taking. The thought hurt unexpectedly. Travis stared at Earl's journal still lying open. I signed those permits because I wanted my company to survive, he admitted quietly. Everybody kept saying the valley was worthless land. Frank said nothing. I never came up here, Travis continued. Never checked what Earl was protecting. He shook his head slowly. I saw numbers. The old SEAL studied his son carefully. You know what the worst part is? Travis looked up. You're not evil. That hurt Travis more than yelling would have. Frank leaned forward slowly. Evil men burn places like this because they enjoy destruction. His voice stayed calm. But regular people destroy things every day because they're busy. The underground station seemed to absorb the words into its stone walls. Travis lowered his eyes again. I don't know how to fix this. Frank looked toward the memorial room, toward the photographs of rescued strangers Earl spent decades protecting. Neither did Earl, he said softly. He just kept helping the next person anyway. Silence settled over them again. Not hostile now. Sad. Human. After a while, Frank stood and walked slowly toward the memorial room. Shadow rose immediately and followed beside him. The old dog never let him walk alone anymore. Inside the memorial room, Frank stopped before one particular wall. Military photographs, missing veterans, recovered men, names nobody else remembered. He stared at them a long time. Then suddenly he saw himself, not literally, but close enough. Invisible men growing older in silence while the world moved on around them. The realization shook him harder than combat memories, because Earl understood it too. That was why he built this station. Not just for rescue missions, for forgotten people. Shadow nudged Frank's hand gently, grounding him again. Frank reached down automatically. His fingers brushed against something hanging from one of the old hooks beside the operations desk. A leash. Worn military K9 leash, faded black nylon. Name stitched carefully into the side. Shadow. Beside it sat a sealed envelope. Frank froze. His name appeared across the front in Earl's handwriting. Frank Dalton. The room suddenly felt very still. Even Travis noticed immediately and stepped closer. You gonna open it? Frank stared at the envelope a long moment, then carefully broke the seal. Inside sat one folded, handwritten letter. The paper trembled slightly in Frank's hands as he unfolded it. Frank, if you're reading this, then either the mountain finally won, or Shadow dragged you back here himself. Truth is, I was counting on the dog. Frank laughed quietly, despite the sting in his chest. That sounded exactly like Earl. He kept reading. You spent your whole life believing war broke you. But broken men don't spend decades carrying other people through darkness. They just don't. Frank swallowed hard. The words blurred briefly before he forced himself to continue. You always thought I disappeared up here because I gave up on people. Truth is, I stayed because people kept needing help. And because I knew someday you would too. The underground station vanished around Frank for a moment. Only Earl's voice remained. Shadow rested against Frank's leg silently while he read. This place was never about hiding from the world. It was about giving forgotten people somewhere to return to. Veterans, runaways, lost kids, old men nobody checks on anymore. People disappear quietly, Frank. Somebody has to keep looking for them. Frank lowered the paper slightly. His eyes burned. Not shame this time. Grief. Relief. Recognition. The final lines waited near the bottom. I know you think you stopped standing watch after the war. You didn't. You were just tired. Rest a while if you need to. Then keep going. Earl Frank closed his eyes. The underground station blurred softly around him. Not from PTSD, from something gentler. Release. Shadow leaned harder against him until Frank finally crouched beside the dog and buried one shaking hand into the thick fur around his neck. Damn you, brother, he whispered hoarsely. Behind him, Travis quietly turned away to give him privacy. The generators hummed softly through the bunker. Water dripped somewhere far above. And deep beneath Black Hollow Ridge, an old Navy SEAL finally allowed himself to stop carrying the war alone for one brief moment. Hours later, the rain stopped entirely. Cold moonlight filtered faintly down the hidden stairwell into the underground station. Frank sat alone beside Earl's operations desk while Shadow slept nearby. Not guarding now. Resting. For the first time since arriving at Black Hollow Ridge, Frank noticed something strange inside himself. Silence. Not emptiness. Peace small. Fragile real. Then above them, faintly through the relay station overhead, came the sound of vehicles climbing the ridge road again. But this time it wasn't Blackwater contractors. It was volunteers, deputies, veterans, rescue workers, people carrying lumber, pumps, fuel, and tools. Coming back, not to bury the station, to save it. Frank stepped out onto the porch of the relay station just before sunrise and watched headlights crawl slowly through the mountain fog below Black Hollow Ridge. Pickup trucks, county utility vehicles, old jeeps coated in mud. Men and women climbed out carrying lumber, fuel cans, toolboxes, coils of wire, and bags of concrete mix. Nobody had been asked to come. They simply did. The cold Appalachian air smelled like wet earth and pine sap, while fog drifted through the valley beneath pale blue morning light. Frank stood there wrapped in Earl's old canvas jacket, while Shadow rested beside his boots. The old Belgian Malinois watched the arrivals quietly, not suspicious anymore, recognizing them. Sheriff Coulter stepped out first, carrying a stack of county documents under one arm. Morning, Dalton. Frank nodded. What's all this? Coulter handed over the papers. Emergency injunction against Blackwater Holdings. A faint grin crossed his weathered face. Turns out rerouting mountain runoff without environmental approval is frowned upon by the state. Wade emerged from the station carrying coffee mugs for everyone. Told you people around here don't much care for outsiders drowning veterans. Several of the volunteers laughed softly. Not loudly. This place somehow discouraged loud voices. A retired Army engineer named Lewis Parker immediately organized work crews around the station perimeter. 2 younger firefighters began reinforcing drainage trenches near the creek. Others carried damaged furniture and soaked records upstairs into dry rooms Earl had once used for storage. The mountain station slowly came alive around them. Frank stood motionless, watching it happen. For years, he believed people only took. But here they were, giving back. Shadow suddenly rose and trotted toward a younger man unloading equipment near the porch steps. The volunteer froze, then slowly smiled. "No way." He crouched carefully. "Shadow?" The dog barked once softly. Frank walked closer. The man looked barely 30. Marine Corps tattoo visible beneath rolled sleeves. "You know him?" The young veteran nodded. 3 years ago, I got lost up here after—" He hesitated slightly. "After some bad nights." Frank understood immediately. PTSD again. The Marine scratched behind Shadow's ears gently. "This dog found me sitting beside a cliff with a bottle of whiskey and a pistol." Silence settled briefly around the porch. The young man looked toward the relay station. "Earl never judged me. Just handed me coffee and let me sleep here 2 days." Frank glanced toward the underground stairwell. Another name. Another life quietly saved. By midday, Black Hollow Ridge no longer resembled an abandoned ruin. Generators roared steadily. Fresh lumber lined the walls. People moved through the station, carrying tools and supplies with quiet purpose. And beneath it all, the underground command center remained open, no longer hidden. Frank spent most of the day underground, cataloging Earl's records with Sheriff Coulter, while volunteers above stabilized the damaged relay station. The deeper they organized the files, the larger Earl's secret life became. Dozens of rescue operations never officially reported. Veterans located alive after being declared missing. Runaways protected from abusive homes. Anonymous payments covering funerals, surgeries, heating bills. Entire lives quietly redirected beneath this mountain. At one point, Megan entered the bunker carrying coffee and stopped beside Frank's chair. "You look different," she said softly. Frank frowned slightly. "How?" She smiled sadly. "Present." The word hit harder than she probably realized, because for years he hadn't been present anywhere. Not after Claire died. Not after retirement. Not after the war buried itself permanently inside his head. But somehow this mountain had pulled him back piece by piece. Not cured him. Just reminded him he still existed. Travis arrived later carrying steel shelving salvaged from Knoxville warehouses. He worked without speaking much, hauling equipment downstairs beside Wade for hours without complaint. The tension between father and son still lingered, but now it carried honesty instead of distance. That mattered. Late that afternoon, Frank discovered another section hidden behind the communications room. A narrow archive space carved deeper into the mountain. Inside sat old training manuals, wilderness maps, emergency medical kits, and dozens of K9 handling records stretching back decades. Shadow followed closely beside him through the narrow corridor. Frank crouched near one shelf and carefully opened an old binder labeled Dalton Mountain Rescue Program. Inside sat handwritten lesson plans. Navigation, emergency triage, wilderness survival, K9 tracking exercises. Earl had been planning something bigger. Not just rescue missions, training, passing it on. Frank flipped another page slowly. "If the station survives me, teach somebody else." The sentence sat alone in the center of the paper. Simple. Direct. Frank leaned back against the stone wall heavily. Earl knew. He knew the station would eventually belong to someone else. Maybe that was why he trusted Frank to come. Not because Frank was perfect, because Frank understood service, even when he no longer understood himself. Shadow rested his head on Frank's knee quietly. The old dog's eyes looked cloudy in the dim light now, age catching him too. Frank scratched gently behind his ears. "You held the line a long time, buddy." Shadow closed his eyes briefly. That evening, the entire valley glowed orange beneath sunset. Volunteers gathered outside the relay station around folding tables, while Harriet Monroe, the diner owner from town, served hot stew from giant metal pots she'd hauled up the mountain herself. Nobody seemed eager to leave. Stories filled the air. Search crews. Storm rescues. Veterans found alive because Earl refused to stop looking. Frank sat quietly near the porch railing, listening. Not speaking much. Just listening. At some point, Sheriff Coulter stepped beside him holding 2 coffee mugs. "You know this place is going to change now." Frank looked toward the mountains. "Yeah. Question is whether that's good or bad." Frank watched volunteers laughing quietly beside stacks of repaired equipment, while Shadow moved slowly among them, accepting scratches behind the ears from strangers he somehow already trusted. Then he looked toward the underground stairwell hidden beneath the relay station. For years, those stairs led only into darkness and secrecy. Now people climbed them, carrying supplies. Hope. Purpose. "Maybe both," Frank answered. Night settled softly across Black Hollow Ridge. One by one, the volunteers headed home down the mountain roads while generators hummed beneath the stars. Eventually, only Frank, Wade, Megan, Travis, and Shadow remained. The station had changed. Not repaired completely, not healed, but alive. Frank descended into the underground command center alone just before midnight. The bunker lights glowed warmly against stone walls lined with maps and memorial photographs. Shadow followed slower now. Tired. The old dog settled beneath Earl's operations desk, exactly where he always had. Frank walked through the chamber quietly, past the rescue records, past the memorial wall, past the names of people who survived because somebody refused to stop searching. At the operations desk, he placed Earl's photograph beside the old K9 leash carefully. The picture showed Earl younger and leaner beside one of the first rescue dogs, named Shadow, both staring directly into the camera with the same steady eyes. Frank stood there a long time, then finally spoke softly into the quiet station. "You kept the watch long enough, brother." Shadow lifted his head slightly beneath the desk. Frank rested one weathered hand against the old dog's neck. "We've got it from here." Outside, dawn slowly began creeping over the mountains again. Morning light filtered faintly through the upper stairwell, far above the underground chamber. Light above, purpose below. Finally connected. Hours later, young volunteers arrived for their first wilderness rescue training session. Teenagers mostly. A few veterans. 2 volunteer firefighters. Frank stood beside the operations table teaching map navigation, while Wade demonstrated emergency rope systems near the bunker wall. Shadow watched everything calmly from beneath the desk. Still supervising. Still standing watch. One teenage boy hesitated near the memorial wall, staring at the photographs. "Who built all this?" he asked quietly. Frank looked around the underground station, at the maps, the records, the names, then toward Earl's photograph beside Shadow's leash. "A man who didn't think forgotten people should stay forgotten." The boy nodded slowly, like he understood more than his age should allow. Training continued. Voices echoed through the underground chamber again. Movement, life. The station no longer hid from the world. It served it. And as the morning sun poured down the hidden stairwell into the bunker beneath Black Hollow Ridge, Frank realized something Earl understood long before he ever did. Some places aren't built to escape people. They're built so lost people have somewhere to return to. The stairs remained open, and for the first time in many years, so did Frank Dalton. If you believe people like Earl and Frank still matter in this country, type "Stand Watch" down in the comments. And if you've ever known someone who carried silent battles long after the war ended, let us know where you're watching from tonight. Subscribe if you want more stories about loyalty, second chances, and the kind of Americans who never stop standing guard when others walk away.